Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, the politics of climate change. Democrats trumpet their plans while Trump plays Weatherman-in-Chief.
It seems to be one of the biggest hurricanes we've ever seen, and that's a problem.
Also this week, former FBI Director Jim Comey gets a less than glowing report card.
And what, if anything, do polls around Labor Day actually tell us about the race for the White House?
Probably not much.
A little bit.
First this.
President Trump began the week by cancelling a trip to Poland, timed to coincide with the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II, so he could oversee the response to Hurricane Dorian. As the storm grew to historic proportions last Sunday, the president sent this warning via Twitter.
In addition to Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama will most likely be hit much harder than anticipated.
Alabama. That came as news to the National Weather Service in Birmingham, Alabama, who tweeted,
Alabama will not see any impacts from Dorian. We repeat, no impacts from Hurricane Dorian will be felt across Alabama. The system will remain too far east.
At the time of the president's tweet, Alabama looked like it was going to be a long way from any impact from the storm. There's Alabama, there's the storm. But President Trump wasn't backing down. On Wednesday, he invited reporters into the Oval Office and he showed them this map, which he says was the first one that he was shown by government weather experts.
And you see it was going to hit not only Florida, but Georgia. Could have was going toward the Gulf. That was what was originally projected.
But wait, if we zoom in on that map, it shows the areas the storm could impact by next Tuesday. It goes into Georgia and the Florida Panhandle and Louisiana, but what's that extra black bit taking in southeast Alabama as well? It looks kind of drawn on. Well, later in the day, reporters got to ask about it.
You showed us the map earlier, the initial forecast of it. It appeared to have been, I guess, edited or something to include Alabama. Can you explain how that change was made?
No, I just know, I know that Alabama was in the original forecast. They thought it would get it as a piece of it.
Okay, let's try a follow-up question.
That map that you showed us today looked like it almost had like a Sharpie.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. But as Sharpiegate gathered almost as much momentum as Dorian itself, the president tweeted out another map.
Almost all models predicted it to go through Florida, also hitting Georgia and Alabama.
Look at the date there, August 28th. That was last Wednesday. He sent his warning to Alabamans on Sunday the 1st of September. So that information was already way out of date. Instead of just admitting that he was not quite accurate, he doubled down, he tripled down. He tweeted about Dorian literally dozens of times, including maps that were more than a week out of date. And then somebody in the White House, maybe the president himself, altered an actual map with a felt tip pen. Technically, that's breaking the law. It created confusion and it overlooked the reality, which of course is that a near neighbour to the United States, the Bahamas, has been devastated. Dozens of people are dead, and states well to the east of Alabama, including Florida and the Carolinas, Georgia as well, still being affected by a major storm event.
That's true, but I'm going to make the same mistake by pointing out that map that Trump tweeted out before was more than just out of date. There it is there. If you look carefully, it seems suspiciously like this map, with once again someone scribbling all over it to make it look like Alabama was affected. In particular, look at this stray red line here. It goes right off the page. My 6-year-old would make a better fist of that. Colour within the lines, guys. To be fair though, Trump's efforts weren't the least welcome political contribution to hurricane preparations. That honour went to Marianne Williamson's tweet, imploring millions of people to see Dorian turn away from the land. That's the creative use of the power of the mind, you see. The difference is, unlike Trump, Williamson was smart enough to quit while she was only that far behind, and she deleted the tweet immediately. Good call, Marianne.
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
And as the campaigning continued ahead of next week's third-round Democratic debate in Houston, Texas, a couple of polls this week showed Senator Elizabeth Warren closing to within striking distance of former Veep Joe Biden. A poll from YouGov and The Economist had Biden on 25%, followed by Warren on 21%, Sanders on 14% and Harris on 8%. While an IDB tip poll put Biden on 28% and Warren again 4 points back on 24%, then Sanders way back on 12% and Harris slipping back further to just 6 points. But other polls this week had Elizabeth Warren as low as 13%. So average them all out and we're pretty much where we've been for a while. Biden leading by over 13 points, with Warren and Sanders basically tied for second, Harris slipping back a bit. Cory Booker has just cracked the top 6, Chad.
Yeah, so why don't we see how this all fits into the broader picture, though? This is the last 6 months of polling averages. Firstly, Beto O'Rourke is going nowhere fast. Pete Buttigieg has spent the last 4 months on a slow glide downwards. Kamala Harris shot up after the first debate and has now shot back down to where she began. Bernie Sanders has been the very picture of consistency, hovering at about 15%. Elizabeth Warren has been like the opposite of Buttigieg, slowly trending up all year. And at the top there, it is inescapable that Biden has maintained a substantial margin the whole time, no matter what embarrassing thing he says. Embarrassing things like this. NPR spoke to Biden this week about his unfortunate vote for the Iraq War back in 2002, and Biden had a curious response. He maintained that he had come out against the Iraq War the moment it started. Alas for Biden, NPR found a quote of his from 9 months after the war started, in which Biden said, "I would vote that way again today. It was a right vote then, and it'll be a correct vote today." So that might get a run in next week's debate.
Maybe he meant it was the moment it started to look as though we were losing.
Maybe. That could slash his lead from 13 points to 12, John.
It could. Well, turning now to this week's marathon television event, the CNN Climate Change Town Hall. 7 bladder-busting hours, 10 candidates each with 40 minutes to answer questions about their various climate policies.
Look, most of the candidates have released mini novels about this issue, so I should speak a little bit about those policies before we go any further. Okay, summarising all these plans is impossible, so let's just note some highlights. Firstly, all candidates have a target of net zero emissions by around the year 2050. They all have targets of net zero emissions in electricity and transport by around 2035. And they all plan to do this through trillions of dollars spent on a clean energy transition over 10 years. They all spend several $100 billion on research, and they all clean up low-income communities. And finally, they all love talking about how many jobs they're going to create. Now, these are all big plans, but some candidates are making their plans seem bigger through gimmickry. Beto O'Rourke, for instance, boasts a $5 trillion mobilisation, of which $1.5 trillion actually comes from the government. The rest is magically generated from other sources somehow. Similarly, Joe Biden's spending $1.7 trillion in a $5 trillion plan. Kamala Harris is spending $3.3 trillion in a $10 trillion plan. And my personal favourite, Julian Castro, has a $10 trillion mobilisation, of which he doesn't even bother to tell us how much is coming from the government. Also, some creative accounting from Andrew Yang, whose spending figures stretch over 20 years for some reason, not 10 years. So you need to halve them to compare to the other candidates. The biggest actual spender, though, you'll be shocked to hear, is Bernie Sanders. With $16.3 trillion of direct government spending, that's about 5 times more than anyone else. And he spends more on individual items than most candidates spend in total. So either he's way overspending or he's the only one who's being honest. For example, $2.2 trillion spent on grants for weatherizing homes and businesses. $2.1 trillion spent on car trade-ins for poor people so they can go electric. $1.3 trillion spent on a benefits package for ex-fossil fuel workers. That's over 6 times what Buttigieg is spending for the same item. Now compare those numbers there to the $780 billion that Sanders is spending on research and development in total. Interestingly though, Sanders is also the only candidate who even pretends he can pay for his plan. He says his plan will pay for itself over 15 years. Although, to be honest, I've got my doubts. For instance, he claims he'll save $1.2 trillion from reducing military expenses related to protecting oil shipping routes. As if all Middle East military spending would just disappear overnight. Also interesting, he promises that after 2035, electricity will be virtually free. And he says he won't rely on nuclear power at all to hit zero-emission electricity by 2030. That's a pretty big ask, given that nuclear energy supplies over half of America's carbon-free electricity. But on the other hand, Sanders is one of the few candidates to promise emission reductions in other countries, which realistically is the only way you can make a serious impact on climate change. Now, I've talked a lot about Sanders here because he supplied more detail than anyone else. The opposite of Sanders, though, are those candidates who dropped largely detail-free plans in the last couple of days, like they were high school kids fudging their homework. And I am talking here about Julian Castro, who at least had the good idea of establishing a national climate council to coordinate the implementation of his program. There was also Kamala Harris, who, like Sanders, emphasised her desire to make fossil fuel companies legally accountable. And then there was Cory Booker, who has a nice shiny head. Then there are the detailed but less ambitious plans of Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg. Biden's plan promises a lot of small ticket items that sound logical, but it's hard to estimate their impact, like combating urban sprawl to encourage denser housing near public transport, or hassling China to be more environmentally accountable. Unlike Sanders, Biden is actively embracing nuclear power and capturing carbon dioxide. Pete Buttigieg is going even further in that regard, with an explicit target of 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide being removable per year by 2040. He also sees an opportunity for farmers to get paid to sequester carbon in the soil. There's a lot of focus on the regional and local areas in Buttigieg's plan. Like Kamala Harris and Andrew Yang, Buttigieg embraces a carbon tax, and he even goes further to suggest a border adjustment tax on products from countries that don't have carbon taxes. Elizabeth Warren shares that same policy. Talking about Elizabeth Warren, her policy is a little bit different. Rather than having one climate change policy, she just keeps mentioning climate change everywhere. But she does have the earliest target, a national zero carbon building standard by 2023. She also offers $100 billion in subsidies for clean energy products to send overseas to reduce emissions there. Once again, probably a good idea. But most importantly, she's basically taken on Jay Inslee's entire climate change policy. And that is massive. Moving on to Andrew Yang, who has very similar policies to most other people, except his point of difference could best be summarised by the optimistic title he's chosen: "It's worse than you think." He'll try anything. Thorium-based reactors, nuclear fusion, moving to higher ground, geoengineering. He's offered funding for all of them, and that's probably a smart move. Finally, I have little to say about Beto O'Rourke's policies because they seem to mean nothing. Get a load of this. He's spending $1 trillion on limited duration, performance-focused climate change tax incentives that accelerate the scale-up of nascent technologies, enabling reductions in greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors through efficiency and alternatives. What's that about? Maybe Beto will solve climate change. He certainly understands hot air. That'll do, John.
Yes, I think it will. Trevor Higgins is the Director of Domestic Climate and Energy Policy at the Centre for American Progress. He's a former advisor to senior Democrats, including California's Dianne Feinstein, and he's with us from our studio in Washington, D.C. Trevor, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you.
We heard lots of plans and targets from the Democratic candidates this week. Are there any that particularly stood out or impressed you?
I think what we're seeing, as much as they're trying to distinguish themselves, we're seeing a lot of broad alignment. Some of the key elements are that the candidates are pledging to reduce emissions 100% by 2050, which is in line with what the United Nations identified as necessary to stabilize global temperatures. And they're putting people at the center of their plans. That means making a commitment to transition workers to good, high-paying jobs. And it means making sure that they're pledging to cut pollution in the communities that have historically borne the brunt of the worst pollution. And I think those are some key elements that I hope any administration would take up in the next term.
Those estimates that the candidates put out of costs and jobs created and target dates of emissions reductions, are any of them at all reliable?
There's been a lot of modeling that has been done to substantiate a lot of different aspects of climate change policy. Some of the projections of specific numbers on terms of cost or jobs are always difficult because you don't know exactly how the economy is going to unfold. But the idea that we can know with certainty that certain policies are going to be on net job producers and are going to cut emissions, I think is generally reliable.
So where is public opinion on this? Will voters see bold targets and promises of spending trillions of dollars as a positive or a negative in 2020?
There's a reason why CNN held their town hall last night, and that's because the Democratic primary voters are demanding action on climate change, and they want to hear from the candidates what their plans are. So among the Democratic primary electorate, it's very clear that people want aggressive action. According to polling that my organization has done, when we asked what the most important aspects of climate change plans were to voters, it wasn't the costs or concerns about how bold the promises are. What they wanted to know was that the promises could realistically be turned into law and would act fast enough to transform the economy consistent with what the science has recommended. So people really care about this.
Do you worry, though, that mainstream voters will only hear Harris is banning drinking straws, not that she's trying to save the planet?
Yeah, I think that the messaging is important, but that the public is ready to hear it. I think it's a new thing now, how much people are paying attention. And they've been met with, it's spurring not only activism, but also interest among the general public. And I think that the people are going to be smart enough to listen for the actual plans, and they'll want to know how they fit into this future. So they want to know, how are the jobs that are being promised going to be real for them? How are their homes going to avoid natural disasters or unnatural disasters? And how are we going to actually see the benefits of pollution reductions in the United States translate into global emissions reductions? And if candidates can make clear how all those points connect, then I think the right message will get across to the voters.
Now, Sanders and Warren are the only ones who've given cold hard specifics on how they intend to pay for their plans. Is that the concern?
I think that some of the candidates have proposed a variety of measures, including wealth taxes, like you mentioned, from Elizabeth Warren. Bernie Sanders had a variety of different pay-fors. Other candidates have talked about using carbon pricing to raise revenues. And I think that the way that we pay for this is something that Congress is going to be able to figure out. I think that there are also a lot of different levers that need to be pulled, and one of the messages we're hearing from the candidates is that they're going to be trying everything at once, from administrative action to legislative action, and within legislative action from standard setting, as well as a variety of different spending measures. So I think that there are a lot of policy tools that are available to put together here, and that Congress and the executive branch will be able to kind of put together a package depending on the results of the election.
To win in 2020, you need to win back some white, blue-collar voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan and Wisconsin who believed Trump when he said that he'd end the war on coal and bring back manufacturing jobs. How does any of this talk of banning drinking straws and gas-guzzling cars help Democrats to win back the Rust Belt?
I think the unfortunate reality is that President Trump's promise to kind of bring back the coal jobs was always premised on a falsehood. Those jobs are being lost largely due to natural gas competition because those prices are so low. And even as he has dismantled a lot of the climate policy that President Obama fought for, those coal jobs haven't come back yet. And in the meantime, he's neglected to take care of those workers in terms of their pensions, their health care, retraining. And I think the Democratic Party needs to get serious about how to provide for a real job opportunities for those specific workers who are going through that transition right now.
Trevor Higgins, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, sir.
It was a short week in the United States with the Labor Day public holiday on Monday. Once upon a time, the arbiters of style maintained you couldn't wear white after Labor Day because it had signalled the end of summer. In the year before a presidential election, Labor Day also marks the serious end of the primary campaign. Just 5 months until the voting begins. The sun hats and beach chairs are packed away and the campaign buttons and yard signs come out. It's the time when voters tend to decide if their favourite candidate is a summertime fling or more the marrying kind, and polls start to get taken a lot more seriously. But do September polls predict the likely nominee or the next president? In 1971, a large field of Democrats were lining up to take on incumbent Republican President Richard Nixon the following year. The Vietnam War was dragging on, major foreign policy achievements like the China trip were still in Nixon's future, and Tricky Dick was looking a little vulnerable.
Generations in the future will look back at this difficult, trying time in America's history.
In September of '71, Senator Ed Muskie of Maine, who'd been nominated for the vice presidency in 1968, was leading Nixon and his rival Democrats in the polls, while Senator George McGovern, who would go on to become the nominee, had just 5 points. After winning the nomination, McGovern lost to Nixon by 23 points in 1972, but 4 years later, Democrats again elevated a long shot to the nomination.
He's a peanut farmer, a Baptist deacon, an 11-year Navy veteran, and a nuclear engineer. Jimmy Carter also would be the first governor since Adlai Stevenson to win the Democratic presidential nomination.
In September of 1975, Jimmy Carter was barely registering 2% in the polls, but Ted Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey didn't run. More than a dozen Democrats did. 16 months later, though, Carter had swept all before him and was sworn in as America's 39th president.
So help me God.
A poll published after Labor Day in 1983 had the eventual nominee Walter Mondale leading second-place Senator John Glenn by 16 points.
That the reason we have $200 billion deficits is that you and some others voted for Reagan.
No, I'll tell you why it is. I'll tell you why it is. It's because
Glenn's campaign was boosted by the name recognition that came from his former career as an astronaut, but Mondale's closest challenger ended up being Gary Hart, who was then at just 4%. By 1987, Senator Hart was leading the Democratic field after Labor Day, despite having dropped out of the race over an extramarital affair that May.
You could smell the blood in the air as the wounded candidate walked into his first post-Rice Story press conference, his run for the presidency on the line.
The Hart soap opera continued for months. He quit, then got back into the race. Meanwhile, the Democrats' eventual nominee, Michael Dukakis, was on just 5%. The next Democratic primary saw another candidate go from obscurity on Labor Day to the nomination the following year. Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton didn't announce that he was running until October of 1991. Remarkably, the top 9 Democrats in the first half of the year all decided not to run against President George Bush, who was flying high after the first Gulf War. Clinton was at below 2% and then around 8% by year's end. By early 1992, Clinton was on his way to the nomination despite a series of scandals, including an admission of having problems in his marriage.
You're looking at two people who love each other. This is not an arrangement or an understanding. This is a marriage. That's a very different thing.
As we saw last week, in 2000, Al Gore had the advantage of being the sitting vice president, and he fended off a challenge from Senator Bill Bradley. Gore led by close to 30 points after Labor Day in 1999, and he cruised to the nomination by a margin of 70 points. 4 years later, the Democratic nominee John Kerry was struggling in September of 2003. A CBS News poll had him in 5th place behind former NATO commander Wes Clark.
A quiet, real American courage. He will make an extraordinary American president.
I'm Wes Clark, and I approve this message.
But as Wes Clark's political inexperience began to show, Kerry's own military record helped him to win over voters at the height of the Iraq War. Just after Labor Day in 2007, Hillary Clinton led future nominee Barack Obama by more than 20 points nationally, John Edwards, the only other candidate above 10%. At the time, Hillary looked like a shoo-in.
To run a campaign that Democrats can be proud of and that independents and Republicans can support, and then to go into the White House with the country behind me and ready to serve.
And 8 years later, Hillary Clinton was again leading after Labor Day, despite having dropped from 58 to 37% in the CNN poll in just 3 months. Weighed down by stories about her use of a private email server as Secretary of State.
The American people are sick and tired of hearing about your damn emails.
Thank you. Me too. Me too.
And that time, of course, she would eventually win the nomination, but not without a fight, and we kept on hearing about those damned emails. So, here is where all the eventual Democratic nominees stood after Labor Day before the primary began. McGovern, 5th on 5, Carter, 6th on 2, Mondale led on 41, Dukakis, 4th on 5, Bill Clinton, 4th on 8, Gore leading on 63, Kerry, 5th place on 8%, Obama 2nd on 24, and Hillary leading on 37. So only 1/3 of poll leaders just after Labor Day have gone on to become the nominee, and none of those frontrunners have ultimately won the presidency. McGovern and Dukakis went from 5% to the nomination, but lost the presidency, while the only 3 successful Democrats in almost half a century, Carter, Clinton and Obama, went from 2%, 8% and 24% respectively. On that basis, polls after Labor Day are not very predictive, and everyone from Bernie down to Booker and Beto right now can take heart from history, but Joe Biden, maybe not so much.
Now, you might recall a few years back, after FBI Director James Comey was sacked, he got a mate of his to leak a memo to the New York Times that detailed Trump's attempts to undermine the Michael Flynn investigation. Now, that leak was so controversial that Rod Rosenstein launched the Mueller probe in response. But was that leak legit? The Inspector General's report is now in, so let's find out!
Big, beautiful world.
Okay, well, this report here is extremely long, so why don't we just rely instead on the expert analysis of ex-FBI Director James Comey, who says that the DOJ Inspector General found no evidence that Comey released any of the classified information contained in any of the memos to members of the media. And then he says, I don't need a public apology from those who defamed me, but a quick message with a sorry we lied about you would be nice. Well, that sounds like case closed then, doesn't it? Oh, but maybe we should just look at that report for a second anyway. Now, Comey believed he could share his memos as he pleased because...
I understood this to be my recollection recorded of my conversation with the president. As a private citizen, I felt free to share that. I thought it very important to get it out.
Interesting, because the Inspector General says that Comey's characterisation of the memos as personal records finds no support in the law, and that the statutory definition of federal records covers any act of creating and recording information by agency personnel in the course of their official duties. Oh, official duties! So, were these meetings official? Well, the IG says that the meetings only took place because of Comey's official position as the director of the FBI, and the content of the meetings was directly tied to FBI investigative activities. So, yes, they were official. In fact, Comey himself at one point wrote in one of the memos that he was attempting to recount in some detail only those parts that related in some way to work. And also, Comey's entire FBI leadership team also said that the memos were records of official business. So that is bad news for Comey. Of course, as soon as you label Comey's memos as official records, then FBI policy required him to surrender those records as soon as he left the FBI. And of course, Comey wasn't authorised to reveal the contents of his memo to the public. Although interestingly, the Inspector General does suggest that Trump's attempts to obstruct the Flynn investigation were relevant somehow to the Flynn investigation itself. I'm not sure I actually agree with that, but you do have to be careful with that kind of information. At least according to St. Comey,
The FBI is very careful in how we handle information about our cases and about the people we are investigating. We just cannot do our work well or fairly if we start talking about it while we're doing it.
But that isn't all. The FBI, unsurprisingly, also has a policy that if you know classified information has been disclosed to an unauthorised person, you've got to tell the FBI straight away. And Memo 2, which Comey had given to his attorneys, had classified information. Now, it was only classified after Comey gave it to his attorneys, but when the FBI allowed Comey to review his memos back in June 2017, they showed him the classification markings, and he still didn't tell them he'd given that memo to his attorneys. Problem! So, when Comey tweeted that the Inspector General found no evidence that Comey or his attorneys released any of the classified information contained in any of the memos to members of the media, then that is correct, to members of the media. But he did leak classified information to his attorney. Now, to be fair, no one is actually saying he did release classified information to the media.
James Comey leaked classified information to the media.
Okay, someone's saying it. But this classified information leaked to Comey's attorneys was pretty lame. There were exactly 6 words in Memo 2 that the FBI said were confidential, which is the lowest level of classification. And by the way, Peter Strzok, who was supposedly trying to destroy Trump, he was one of the people that made that classification. But anyway, of those 6 words, 4 of them were just names of foreign countries. And when challenged in court, only 1 of those words kept its classification. Yes, we are talking about 1 word at the lowest level of classification, which, by the way, was declared by his lawyer a couple of days later anyway. And CNN's legal analyst had one more point to make about all this. He pointed out that Trump asked Comey to drop the criminal investigation of Trump's friend, and Comey was just exposing Trump for doing that. So Trump's corrupt acts were the real problem, not Comey's attempt to expose them. Now look, that's a reasonable point, but the Inspector General didn't say that Comey should let Trump get away with it. He said that Comey could have legally disclosed that information that concerned him to all these bodies. There's heaps of them, including Congress, by the way, which is exactly where Comey went as soon as the leak came out. Comey also could have spoken publicly about his belief that Trump's comments, combined with Comey's sacking, were an effort to obstruct justice. That would have made news if he'd said that. But Comey chose a different and more dubious path. So, regardless of how you feel about Trump, Comey did treat official records like they were his personal possessions, even though he, as the FBI director, should have known better, and I personally suspect he did, especially since this is the kind of offence he chastised Hillary Clinton for. Comey not only kept those memos for himself, but he leaked one of them to the press, and even after he found out one of them contained confidential information, a tiny amount, he still didn't tell anyone that he'd passed that memo on. Furthermore, he's been sanctimonious and hypocritical.
Perhaps never in the history of our country has someone been more thoroughly disgraced and excoriated than James Comey.
Oh, do we have to choose one of those 2?
Big, beautiful one.
The week began with another mass shooting in Texas. 7 people were killed and more than 20 others were wounded in the drive-by attack on the interstate between the West Texas towns of Midland and Odessa last Saturday. It came 4 weeks after the shootings in El Paso and Dayton, which left 31 people dead. The latest attack reignited a familiar debate, Democrats calling for more gun control, Republicans blaming it on mental health. Former Texas Congressman and Democratic presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke is again calling for an assault weapons ban and an Australian-style gun buyback. And he summed up the feelings of many this week when he said,
averaging about 300 mass shootings a year. No other country comes close. So yes, this is up.
And you can see just how authentic and not at all cynical the Beto O'Rourke campaign is by the way they were selling "This is effed up" shirts before the day was over.
You're not a fan. You're not a fan. Other Democrats called for expanded background checks and state as well as federal action on this.
Make sure that people
who should not be owning guns don't own those guns. So that means expanding background checks.
It is time for Congress and for state legislatures, including the one in Texas, to do something, not just talk.
As for Washington, President Trump wasn't offering a lot of hope on that front.
For the most part, as strong as you make your background checks, they would not have stopped any of it. So it's a big problem. It's a mental problem. It's a big problem.
And Democratic frontrunner Joe Biden says he doesn't see room for compromise with congressional Republicans or the current president.
I've seen nothing. The president has no intestinal fortitude to deal with this. He knows better. His instinct was to say, yeah, we're going to do something on background check. What's he doing? Come on. This is disgraceful.
The Democrat majority House of Representatives already passed a universal background check bill earlier in the year, which so far the Republican-dominated Senate won't even debate, much less bring to a vote. Here's House Republican Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who says he's open to a bipartisan approach, but again, he wants to shift the focus away from gun control.
What we really have to look at here is, you know that mental health is a disturbing issue that these individuals have. To be able to take a gun, go kill individuals that they do not know.
Meanwhile, Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell says that he'll bring any gun legislation that has the president's support to the floor of the Senate for a vote. But right now, the president is retreating from background checks at a pretty rapid rate, Chaz.
Yeah, I can tell you what the president is supporting right now. It's the White House is reportedly focusing on the death penalty for mass shooters, which seems a little bit pointless because the death penalty already exists for mass shooters in 30 states as well as under federal law. And most of those states, they're where the shooters are. Also, out of the 82 mass shootings since 2006, 30 of the gunmen shot themselves and 16 were killed. So they have a 56% chance of death already anyway. Trump does seem to have gone off universal background checks again though, which is odd because unlike what Trump suggested in that clip, this shooting might have been one of the ones where background checks could have made a difference. The shooter tried to buy a gun in 2014, but failed because of a background check. So they're still trying to work out how he got his hands on a gun. If he bought it through a private sale, that's exactly what universal background checks are supposed to stop. Although, let's be honest, there's more to mass shootings than background checks. In the 1970s, there were 5 deaths a year due to mass shootings. In the 80s, 14 deaths a year. In the 90s, 21 deaths a year. In the 2000s, 23 deaths a year. In the 10s, 51 deaths a year. Now, just last month, there were 38 deaths. Mass shootings are part of the culture now, and they are becoming increasingly hard to scrub out. Also, to contradict Julian Castro, I'm not sure the states offer much hope for gun control either. Take Texas, where way too many of these shootings take place. Back in 2015, their governor famously tweeted that he was embarrassed that Texas was number 2 for new gun purchases behind California. And he urged them, let's pick up the pace, Texans. That was a couple of days before the Colorado Springs shooting. And as many have noted, Texas gun laws actually became looser the day after this latest shooting, although those laws had been passed weeks earlier, and to be honest, they were pretty minor. They allowed people to carry guns without licenses for the week after a disaster zone has been declared. They stopped landlords banning renters from having guns on their property, and they forced houses of worship to put signs up if they wanted to be gun-free zones. Not really a big deal, it's just the symbolism more than anything. The thing though is, symbolism cuts both ways. Retail giant Walmart has announced that it's discontinuing sales of short barrel rifle ammunition and handgun ammunition. That will reduce their market share from 20% of American ammunition sales to around 6 to 9% of them. And the NRA were not thrilled about that, tweeting out that the strongest defense of freedom has always been our free market economy. But of course, that's what Walmart are responding to. The commercial power of the gun controlling market. And that might be the way forward for gun controllers, fighting guns in the commercial sphere rather than the legislative sphere. Certainly the NRA are weaker opponents right now than they've ever been before. They currently have higher unfavourables than favourables. That wasn't even the case back in January 2013, just after the Sandy Hook shooting. So we'll see where this goes.
Yeah, indeed. In a major win for Democrats this week, North Carolina's state court has struck down a legislative district map as unconstitutional. This landmark ruling from a panel of 3 judges found, quote, the 2017 maps do not permit voters to freely choose their representative and amounts to sophisticated partisan sorting. That gerrymander, as the Daily Tar Heel reported last November, meant that while Democrats won 50% of the Senate vote, they won just 42% of the Senate seats, and 50.5% of the House vote gave them just 45% of House seats. And that has stopped North Carolina's Democrat Governor, Roy Cooper, from getting much of really anything done. The same thing has happened to Democrat governors elected last year in both Michigan and Wisconsin. It was earlier this year that the US Supreme Court ruled that federal courts didn't really have a role in these kinds of state-based gerrymander cases, but this North Carolina ruling is expected to become a template for other cases in places like Maryland, Texas and Wisconsin as well.
Yeah, the Supreme Court basically said it's none of our business. But they did hold that state constitutions could provide standards and guidance for state courts to apply, which is what's happened here. In this case, the court said the state constitution guarantees free elections, which means that all elections must be conducted freely and honestly to ascertain fairly and truthfully the will of the people. Well, see how fair and truthful you think these elections were. This was one of the Republicans who redrew the boundaries.
I propose that we draw the maps to give a partisan advantage to 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats, because I do not believe it's possible to draw a map with 11 Republicans and 2 Democrats.
Looks pretty brazen to me.
Not at all, Dorian.
And this ruling is significant because it can't really be overturned by the Supreme Court. And also, almost every state constitution has those same provisions. So this might be the beginning of the end for gerrymandering.
That would make a big difference. Now, before we go, you've got a little bit of economic news as well.
I do, and it's not great. The manufacturing index has shown an actual contraction in factory activity for the first time since 2016. Back then. Now, manufacturing only represents 11% of output and 8% of employment, but it's still pretty important for Trump. What's important to the economy, though, is consumer spending. And so the rapid fall of the Consumer Sentiment Index to its lowest level since 2016 would also be concerning for the administration. Having said that, these are just 2 indicators. Something that has been very consistently positive for the Trump administration has been the unemployment figures. And they come out again now, as you are watching this at home. So hop onto the internet and see if, for America's sake, they've met expectations. Economists are expecting about 150,000 new jobs and a steady unemployment rate. So there is your bar. If the figures are in that ballpark, it's all good. But if there's less than 100,000 new jobs, say, the market might start to tighten up that little bit more.
Yeah, interesting. All right, that is it for another week. But if you haven't had enough of this good stuff, there's plenty more to be heard.
Of course they haven't had enough. Much more on our Planet Extra for iView, Facebook and YouTube. See you there.
Bye-bye.